Hello there, my name is Catherine Prince. I am the Consultant Project Manager with WSP USA. I lead the Climate Resilience and Sustainability practice in Florida. I look forward to working with you on this project. Let's get started. Hollywood Boulevard, the project we will be discussing, is in its initial phase. We have a few years before we begin any construction. In the coming months, you will see Florida DOT working on the corridor unrelated to this project. So let's get to the intent. Today's meeting is intended to kick off developing the community's vision for Hollywood Boulevard. At the same time, this vision will be grounded in engineering judgment, and we will make sure it is constructible, and we will gather the cost estimates as well. All this to ensure we can actually build this project in the future phases. Our goal today is to listen to you. As I mentioned, we are kickstarting the community engagement. Before we came to you, we did a little bit of work, which is the first step in understanding climate risk. This step really entails understanding what the future climate condition is for Hollywood, on the boulevard especially, its impacts on the boulevard, which is the infrastructure, as well as looking at how it impacts the community adjacent, the Hollywood Lakes area, and the larger community, the Broward community that it serves. And we are here today to meet with you to help us understand, help us get information on how you would like to see these adaptation strategies for Hollywood Boulevard. But we begin with understanding climate risk. Why understanding climate risk? It really helps us make a informed decision on how we invest on the corridor. Think of it like when we buy a house and we want to make upgrades, really for hurricane upgrades. The type of upgrades we make really depends on the level of risk we want to reduce. And when we make these investments, we always consider what is the cost, what are the benefits that these investments bring us. And these are the same considerations we will use for this infrastructure, Hollywood Boulevard. And when we do not always eliminate all the risks, we tend to then transfer the risk through insurance or sometimes assume some of the residual risk. So identifying what is the most cost feasible investment is the intent of this study. So once we understand what is the climate risk on the boulevard, we can understand and determine the risk we want to avoid. And most importantly, we want to be very clear on the risk that is residual above and beyond our proposed improvements. Later today, we will share with you some options for adaptation. Then we would love to hear from you on the strategies you would like to see implemented on Hollywood Boulevard. The next time we see you, end of this year, early next year, we will use the information we collect today and develop two design options. We will present each option with benefits as well as costs. So you can see the level of risk reduction and the associated preliminary costs. The third and the last time we see you, we will share with you the preferred design and any supporting strategies like policies or ordinances, get your final feedback. After this meeting, with your buy-in, the project will be adopted by the Broward MPO board and hopefully identified funding, be it grant funding or capital funding, in the future phases. I've mentioned the word climate risk a few times. So what is climate risk? So climate risk is really a combination of hazards, climate stressors, climate hazards, the word used interchangeably. The hazards look like flooding, and also looking at how probable these instances are to occur, which is how often do they occur. And then we also, like I mentioned earlier, really want to consider the impacts these stressors have on infrastructure as well as these adjacent communities. In the coming slides, we will look at climate stressors, then their probabilities, and then discuss consequences to the community the boulevard serves. Climate stressors. So the community in in Hollywood, especially East Hollywood, Hollywood Lakes, is very familiar with climate hazards. We have already seen tidal flooding every time there's a king tide or high tide. We know that there is flooding that occurs on our streets. We know that the groundwater elevation is changing. And really today we want to focus on flooding as a focus. The other hazards which we are very well aware of, but we will not be discussing today, are extreme heat and humidity, as well as extreme wind. Now that we looked at some of the climate stressors, let's look at their probabilities. So we've reviewed a number of climate scenarios, and these are a combination of stressors like heavy rain, noted here as 10-year, 25-year, or 100-year rainfall, both in the current conditions as well as in the future. So you will see the years in the third column, 2022, 2021, which is considered current, the most recent data, 2020, 2040, and 2070. So we're looking at future conditions as well. And when we look at these stressors, we are also considering the high tide, which we see often in the Hollywood Lakes area. Now, what we want to look at is how probable all these instances are occurring or is proposed to occur in future years. So we've assigned a likelihood of occurrence, which is a highly likely, likely, and less likely, and we've noted them accordingly in this chart. So a combination of events happening both now and in the future is noted here in this last column. And as I mentioned, we looked at a number of scenarios, both current as well as future. And you will see that we've taken future stressors as high as Category 5 hurricane into consideration. These events are less likely to occur both in the current conditions as well as in the future conditions. So once we looked at probabilities, now we want to look at impacts, which is we have quantified it as the average ponding time, which is how long the water stays on the ground before it dissipates. When the water stays on the ground on the roadway, it impedes mobility and creates unsafe conditions for people trying to walk, bike, try to use transit, or even ride in their personal vehicles. So the average ponding time is used, and we've categorized it from low impact to very high impact. The chart looks very, it has a lot of information on it. If you would just simply focus on the probability of occurrence and the impact. So a very highly likely a stressor has low impact. However, as we go up and use heavier stressors, the less likely events like the Category 5 hurricane are going to have a very high impact. So again, simply looking at it as the more probable hazard climate stressors are going to have less impact, low impact, and the more probable, the less likely events are going to have very high impact. So with that, let's look at these a little bit more visually on maps. So this is an example of a highly likely event, which is a 10-year rainfall during high tide. We are looking at this event both in today's conditions as well as future conditions in 2040. So you can see that the event is highly likely, but it has low impact when we look at the ponding time on the boulevard itself. Now we're looking at a likely event, which is a 25-year rainfall combined with a high tide event. Now, even though this is a likely event, it has low impact. Again, looking at today's impact as well as the future impact in 2040. Now we're looking at a less likely event, which is a 100-year rainfall combined with a high tide event. Now you can see that there's more flooding both in today's conditions as well as future condition, but they are both low medium impact and low medium impact based on the flooding time, ponding time. Now let's look at a less likely event, which is a 10-year rainfall combined with a high tide event and a category 5 hurricane. Now this event is less likely to occur. However, when we look at today's impact or the impact today, it is a high medium impact. However, when we look at the same climate condition in the future, 20 years in 2040, the impact is very high. So the climate conditions or this stressor occurring in the future, the impacts are higher in the future than today. Now that we have discussed climate risk on the boulevard itself, let's look at some consequences. So how does it matter? So we want to look at how these stressors impact the community it serves. So we know that for one, mobility is going to be a challenge when there's ponding on the roadway, when the roadway is flooded, mobility, and it disproportionately impacts emergency vehicles trying to get to community members in need when the boulevard is flooded. It is the major connector between the beaches and Hollywood lakes. The alternate is 1 mile north on Sheridan or 1 mile south on Hallandale Boulevard. So Hollywood Boulevard serves a critical community mobility connection across the beach. Also, when we look at evacuation, when there's a declared a disaster or hurricane required evacuation, Hollywood Boulevard serves as an evacuation route from the beaches to I-95, the designated north-south connector. When looking at consequences over the long term, we used information from the Climate and Economic Justice Screening Tool from the White House. This image that you see in front of you today, if you could focus on the Hollywood Lakes area. As it stands, the socioeconomic conditions of the lakes area is in the higher percentile income, which also the buildings and the homes in this area have a higher appraised value compared to the communities adjacent to it. So when we look at the future conditions, also another a data that pops up is that there is a higher expected building loss rate within the same Hollywood Lakes neighborhood compared to the other communities. So the anticipated building loss each year into the future is very high, and so is the population loss rate over the coming years into the future. These are the consequences of climate risk, looking at it long term. So the takeaway really for us from this is very clearly that Hollywood Boulevard is expected to be functionally impacted, which is that it is going to hold water for longer periods of time today and in the future conditions when these climate stressors are in the location, and the impacts to the community, especially the access to emergency vehicles, is extremely high. So the question in front of us today is, what do we want to invest in? What is the level of resilience we want to invest in? Do we keep it as it is right now, or do we want to look at a higher level of infrastructure investment to reduce the climate risk, reduce the ponding time and the frequency on the boulevard as these climate stressors are increasing in frequency as well as in intensity. Before we start designing alternates, it's important to consider that the city of Hollywood is already planning on making stormwater investments. And we discussed the climate risk as well as the investment. The city of Hollywood is proposing an investment for a highly likely event, which is a 10-year event. So Hollywood Boulevard would stay mostly dry with at least between 3 inches and 6 inches topping when it receives a 10-year rainfall event. However, there is a residual risk. So any event over a 10-year rainfall would result in flooding. The question we are going to explore a little further today is, how much more should we invest in? Do we want to invest in larger likely events or less likely events? The question is, how much do we want to reduce climate risk?